Hi, everyone. Let's get started. My name is Paige Arthur. I'm the Deputy Director at the Center on International Cooperation at NYU, and it's really my pleasure today to welcome you to this event. It is actually the first in a series of events that's led by the World Bank and the United Nations on compound risk. So we're very happy to be partnered with them for this initial launch of the series. And we're especially delighted to convene three leading thinkers on compound risk from three distinct yet related fields. I think everyone has come to have a kind of intuitive sense of compound risk as we've experienced the effects of COVID-19 in our daily lives. And we've also, been reading about rising risks of many different kinds around the world. In August, my organization, the NYU Center on International Cooperation, briefed the UN Security Council on the secondary and tertiary risks to international peace and security of the COVID-19 crisis, noting such effects as negative impacts on food security, particularly in conflict zones, trends in remittances, in trade and migration, in the inequality in access to public institutions, in particular public health. All of these may create rising risk for social destabilization and conflict. And of course, we were drawing on this evolving language that we're going to talk about today around compound, or sometimes called cascading risks. And I love one of the ways that Susan Cutter, who's here with us today, has described this in relation to cascades, where she says cascades occur as a consequence of the loss of capacity in one system, overwhelming a connected system, elevating the impacts from hazard to disaster to catastrophe. And we are seeing this every day now in a very practical, not a theoretical way. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and just want to note that CIC's involvement in this event is related to our ongoing work to support data-driven approaches to peace building and prevention. And we have a monthly Data for Peace Dialogue series. I'll put some information about that in the chat. But now I'm very pleased to hand things over to Bianca Adam, who's the team lead for compound risk analytics and crisis preparedness in the Global Crisis Risk Platform at the World Bank. Over to you, Bianca.
Thank you, Paige. Hi, everyone. As Paige mentioned, my name is Bianca. I work at the World Bank on the Global Crisis Risk Platform. So the initiative that I work on compound risk and crisis preparedness analytics really sort of is very much aligned with many of the priorities that Paige mentioned in her introduction. And as you can imagine, given our role as the World Bank, as a development institution focused on ending extreme poverty, helping our client governments, the governments we work with, manage this increasingly complex risk landscape is increasingly become a priority and a focus of our work. So over the past several years, we've really stepped up efforts to look at risk in a holistic, comprehensive way. We have a lot of expertise and experience working on risk sectorally, so looking at disaster risk, looking at public health risks, etc., in isolation. But we're trying to bring this expertise together and really develop a holistic view of risk. And one of our priorities right now is developing an in-house system to monitor and identify emerging compound risk. And that's why I'm very excited about the conversation today and to hear from Susan, Jakob, and Harvard, and from the audience as well about the latest developments on the tracking, monitoring, understanding of compound risk. And just very briefly, as Paige mentioned, this webinar is part of a series that we are co-organizing together with colleagues at the UN, at UNOCHA, UNPBSO, and the Center for Disaster Protection in London. it's the first of this series, and we have another webinar coming up in a couple of weeks as part of the Understanding Risk Conference. My colleague Lindsay, who should be on the line, can perhaps share the link to that webinar, and if not, we'll share it later. And we're really trying to sort of start generate a conversation around these topics, both on the technical aspects of understanding, assessing, identifying compound risk, but also on the operational perspective. How do we take this information and translate it into early action, into prioritized programming to support our client governments in making decisions? And unfortunately, 2020 has really been a reminder of the importance of these conversations. As many governments, both our recipient governments, the developing countries we work with, but also our donor governments, are finding themselves in an increasingly tight fiscal space and having to make very tough decisions about prioritizations. So we're really hoping to through these conversations to help shape up a community of practice of academics, practitioners who are working and thinking about these topics. And so we hope that this conversation can be can help generate interest, and so we hope to get more partners as part of this conversation going forward. I'm going to end here for now to let our speakers speak and hand over back to Paige. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bianca. And I am also very, very cognizant of one of the really important points you make about the really tight fiscal space that countries are facing now and how that's kind of shaping the risk environment for them. And very supportive of this idea of creating and strengthening community of practice around compound risk. So with that in mind, let's go first to Jakob Zeischler, who is the SNF Ambizioni Fellow at Climate Environmental Physics, the Physics Institute, the University of Bern in Switzerland. So Jakob, please, will you kick things off for us?
Yeah, so hello. My name is Jakob. I recently also joined the Hermes Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig. And I will be talking, so my background is climate science, and I will be talking, giving some input on climate, weather, and compound climate and weather events, or weather and climate events. And the other two speakers will then cover a bit more broad space in the compound risk domain. So my input will be mostly on the climate side of things, but I think some of these concepts that I will share with you in a few minutes are also applicable to other domains. And just to give some background, if you think about projections of climate extremes, or if you look into the IPCC projections of climate extremes, these are often focusing on univariate indicators such as extreme temperatures, frequency of heat waves, heavy precipitation events, dry spell lengths, intensity of droughts. There are a number of these type of indicators, and we can look at these maps, how they will change in the future. But if we think about impacts in more detail, we know that most of them are actually not driven by single extreme events. People from disaster risk research, they will know this, but also thinking about direct climate impacts, often they are not just driven by single extremes. But so far, there's relatively limited knowledge on the links between different climate extremes. And this motivated the notion of compound weather and climate events, which refer to the combination of multiple drivers and or hazards that contributes to societal or environmental risk. So this definition was defined or basically developed with a highly interdisciplinary group of different people, and to really build a new framework of analysis also for these type of events. And you can visualize this as basically events in weather and climate space that lead to an impact or potential impact, and which are related to multiple drivers or multiple hazards. So hazards here can be things like a heat wave or a flood, drivers could be things like a heavy precipitation event, and then these are typically affected by modulators like circulation patterns, or for instance, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And climate change can now affect then all of these different components. So the concept of compound weather and climate events can also be linked to the IPCC risk framework, which links risk with hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. So risk is basically a function of these three aspects. And compound climate and weather events are, we are concerned about the hazard part of the risk equation. So we want to better understand how multiple drivers or multiple hazards affect risk, and how we can quantify this and analyze this. If you now think about events that fall into this conceptual idea, there's a huge variety of different event types. And this is why we proposed recently a typology of compound events. And we proposed 4 different types, which should then aid the development of new methods to analyze them and also conceptually think about them. And the first class that we define are the preconditioned events, where we have a precondition which is related to some climatic driver. And because of this precondition, a second driver can then cause a hazard and a successive impact. And in a way, the impact, so the idea is that the impact is only that large because of the precondition. So without the precondition, maybe we wouldn't even have the impact at all. The second class of events are multivariate events. Here, the key concept is that we have multiple hazards or multiple drivers that occur at the same time, for instance, in the same region. This could be, for instance, concurrent hot and dry events that then lead to an amplified impact. The third class are temporally compounding events. Here, the key idea is that we have a sequence of hazards, for instance, a sequence of heat waves or a sequence of heavy precipitation events that then lead to an amplified impact. These hazards can also be of different type. So one could have a tropical cyclone followed by a deadly heat wave, for instance. And finally, we have spatially compounding events, where we have the key concept is that we have driver hazard combinations in different regions of the world, which then affect the same system, for instance, the food system, and then lead to an integrated impact. So as an example of a temporally compounding event, I quickly wanted to show this image here, the satellite image of the hurricane season in 2017, where we had this sequence of 3 hurricanes, Katia, Irma, and Jose, hitting the Caribbean. And you can imagine that basically the vulnerability of the affected regions gets affected by the first hurricane, and then leading to amplified impacts of the second. And also the sequence of events can deplete emergency response funds. As an example of spatially compounding event, I want to show this event here, where El Nino, in a strong El Nino event in 1983, led to droughts in North America, in Brazil, and in South Africa, and then led to the largest crop failure event in modern history. So here, the global food production system is an integrator that integrates different hazards across the world into an amplified impact. And my background is climate science, but you can probably apply these concepts also to non-climatic aspects. For instance, one can think of the current global pandemic as a precondition to climate hazards and to amplified impacts. So this is a map showing all kinds of potential climate hazards that are occurring or could occur during the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can imagine that the pandemic is increasing the vulnerability of many countries to these hazards, and then helping to amplify impacts. So what are challenges when thinking about compound events? So one of the key challenges is that we need to understand the dependence between drivers of these events. So if you think about conceptually, if you think about this, we can visualize here a relationship between two different drivers or hazards, as they're completely independent, so points can fall in any place of this circle. And if you think, if you have some critical threshold here, the likelihood of exceeding this threshold, this multivariate threshold, is very low. But now if these drivers or hazards are strongly correlated, then the likelihood of exceeding this multivariate threshold is substantially larger. So basically, understanding the dependence between relevant drivers of impacts is crucial to understand risks and estimate risks. But this is not so easy. It's easier said than done. So one challenge is, of course, how do you identify these relevant drivers, and how do you identify the critical thresholds? So this requires typically data on impacts, which is often not easy to obtain. And it also requires a highly interdisciplinary approach. You need to bridge climate sciences, climate impact modeling, and statistics to really get good estimates of these risks. Then I would like to touch on potential climate change effects on compound events in the climate domain. But again, these concepts can be certainly also applied to other areas. So here, again, a simple visualization of a bivariate distribution between two hazards or two drivers, and then a moderate and an extreme impact threshold. And what is illustrated here, that a simple shift in the mean in one of the drivers can lead to a strongly increased risk of compound events. And this can also happen with different changes in the distribution. So if you have an increased variance, as shown in the middle figure here, in one of the distributions, again, this can lead to a strong increase in compound events. And the final example is an increase in dependence, which is similar to what I showed in the slide before. So climate change affects all of these driving variables and also the dependencies between the drivers, and then affect risks. And of course, this also applies to non-climatic drivers. So if you have changes in demographic distribution, in social, you might have social instability, political unrest, changes in economy, international trade. These are all drivers of risks. And if these affect then risk, and in combination, if they are correlated to other drivers, they need to be taken into account to estimate risks. So the current research priorities in this weather and climate domain is to develop a robust tool set for compound event analysis and forecasting, for instance, based on the presented typology as a guiding framework, to collect data on impacts and to identify impact drivers. And then finally, also to assess how well climate and climate impact models represent compound events. And as I said, so I think many of these priorities can also be applied to the non-climatic domain. And with this, I would like to close, and I'm looking forward to a discussion.
Many thanks, Jakob, for that. And some of I think it's very helpful to have such a clear overview of what compound risk is. And of course, also some of the challenges in assessing compound risk. And I like the way you identified the need to understand the dependence between different drivers of risk, and the challenge of even identifying the drivers and the critical thresholds. And very much noted that this requires a highly interdisciplinary approach, and that way kind of validates the idea behind this panel, which was to bring together people from different fields to discuss this. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Susan Cutter, who is the Distinguished Carolina Professor at the University of South Carolina, and also the Director of the Hazards and Vulnerability Research Institute there. Susan.
Thank you, Paige. Are the slides up?
Yes, we see them.
All right. What I'd like to do with my few minutes is to give you some reflections based on the hazards and disasters research community. For a long period of time, the hazards and disasters researchers have been engaged in looking at the changing nature of disaster risk. As a community, we are by definition interdisciplinary with contributions from engineering sciences, health sciences, natural sciences, social sciences. But what we have seen over the last decade or so are some major structural changes in how we're thinking about disaster risk. We know that we're seeing transitions in disaster risk where the singular events have major consequences in proximate space that is very close to where they occur, but that we see these less extreme chronic events may be more impactful on places in the longer term. We may also see that catastrophic damage can accrue from non-extreme physical forces. So events that may be at the 95th percentile will cause extreme impacts from a physical perspective, but they may not cause extreme impacts from a social perspective. We see that cascading disasters are now the norm. This is partially as a result of increasing exposure and a combination of increasing vulnerability and societal reproduction of risk itself. We see that the broad scale processes, global processes of industrialization, globalization, and technology produce more interdependency among these systems. And what this means is that we can begin to see some unintended consequences from everyday events that we haven't seen previously. This is all occurring within the context of major inequalities in disaster risk, which continue to persist. And these are oftentimes increasing at rates and accelerating beyond the capacity of places to cope with them. This is related to demographic changes, which are increasing the disparities and concentrating the disaster risk at the lowest rung of the wealth ladder in many places. And what we see is that the impacts are increasingly spatially and generationally detrimental, specifically to women and children. The state of the art within my community is really looking at the interdependent and globalized systems and how these are creating the potential for the disruption of regional and global economies and resulting oftentimes in humanitarian crises. We see that there are, in fact, more extreme events with extreme impacts, and there is a lot of research effort looking at scale dependencies from local to global, but also looking at intensity versus impact determinations. You don't need an intense storm to produce major consequences. And I think because we are an interdisciplinary community, we recognize the limits of the disciplinary science. And while we operate in an interdisciplinary environment, we still have stovepipes, and our research is still not as integrated as we would like, where the natural scientists are talking to the engineers, who are talking to the economists, who are talking to the sociologists, and so forth. So we have a lot of challenges that our community is facing as the world is changing and as the very nature of disaster risk itself is changing. And I illustrate here the cascade that we see in Nicaragua that experienced 2 Category 4 storms within the past 2 weeks. And the outlook for recovery is going to be primarily focused in on exposure and pre-existing vulnerabilities in those communities. Moving forward, what we see is a need to improve our understanding, as Jacob mentioned, of these dynamic pressures and their influence on the spatial and temporal patterns of disaster risk. And it's not an easy system to understand, in large part because we have these broad social, economic, political, and historical processes that are influencing not only the natural systems, where humans increasingly are becoming geomorphic agents and modifying landscapes and modifying the atmosphere, but they also influence social systems and the built environment. And so without understanding the context within which these events are occurring, we're not going to get very far in our focus on compound or cascading events. I think moving forward, we need to think in terms of complex systems, which this is. We need to think of multi-method approaches. It's not just statistically driven or quantitatively driven. We also have to understand qualitative assessments of these understanding. We need to move beyond the silos of our disciplines and do more integrated knowledge and tool development, again, as Jacob suggested. From my perspective, the focus should be on place-based understanding, not individual hazard agents or individual risks, because places are where these disasters affect. And it's these places in their natural systems, their built environment, and their social systems that are the ones that will be disproportionately affected. One of the ways in which the disaster community has moved forward is it developed a research program called the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk that is supported by the international scientific unions as well as the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. And part of that effort was to get the disaster risk community to move beyond the disciplinary or multidisciplinary approach to our science, but to create interdisciplinary work and then move that forward into what we call transdisciplinary work, where the transdisciplinary work is where you engage the local stakeholders and the people affected in the co-production, not only of knowledge, but the co-production of tools and the co-production of understanding and development of policies and mitigation strategies. So in order to move forward in the monitoring area, you need to establish baselines. You need to have some basis for which you can assess how well you're doing or not doing. So you need a baseline. But in establishing those baselines, they can't be done in isolation. You, again, need to involve those at the local level. And in establishing those baselines, you need to be cognizant of the inequalities in the potential impacts so that all groups are represented. There's also the need for understanding the localized nature of disaster risk. and top-down universal approaches to disaster risk reduction are not going to be very effective because not all places are the same. And the combination of risk, vulnerability, and hazards are different in places of the world. Some have more emphasis on vulnerability, others have more emphasis on the hazard. And so there needs to be some level of customization here. To be effective, metrics and monitoring should be aligned with ongoing practices and policies at the local scales. And this is one way to improve data and record keeping by making it part of the normal operations of localities in terms of their spatial planning or their social services or peacekeeping or infrastructure development. If they operate in planning, it's just as easy to gather data as they're doing that planning on some of the mitigation or risk reduction efforts that they have engaged in. And finally, the need is to prioritize the context in understanding the context within which the disaster risk occurs, and being able to measure effectively the context and the interaction of drivers and outcomes, as Jakob demonstrated in the climate example. But at the same time, we need to recognize that these are temporal and spatially fluid, and that compound risk can be viewed as a condition long term that is a function of many factors, some of which may be related to the governance structures in communities, the social structures in communities, but can also be viewed as a situation or short term. And so these sorts of processes and trying to understand this very complex system is not particularly easy, but poses a major challenge for our science and our practice. So what I would suggest is a reframing that is necessary to move compound risk beyond a single sector or a single hazard construct. And to do that, we need to co-develop with local stakeholders, local residents, integrated tools that capture the community needs and the community abilities. Within the hazards community, we know that all disasters are local and all disasters occur within a broader context. And so in looking at response, we need to understand the integrated nature of not only the context, but all the hazards that affect that particular place. For monitoring, we need to know where we started. This argues for baselines, and to develop, in addition to the baselines, an appropriate outcome measure so you can test the effectiveness of your metrics and monitoring to see if you're making progress toward that particular outcome. That particular outcome needs to be developed in consultation with the local stakeholders and the co-production. The monitoring needs to be evaluated and adjusted as the context changes, because the contexts do change. And one of the big problems that we've seen thus far in my community are really related to data needs, and data needs at subnational scales. And this is where we run into problems. We might be able to do some global assessments, but when you start to look at it in more detail at subnational levels, the data just are not there. And finally, and this is really my take-home message, is the engagement. And the science must be translated into practice, but the practice also must inform the science. And we need to make the science so that it's usable, useful, and used. And in doing so, we then will provide the evidentiary basis for policy and practice and change, and ultimately disaster risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that. And again, emphasizing interdisciplinary approaches. I mean, among many, many other things, but also, I think very importantly, bringing in the transdisciplinary approaches on really meaningful inclusion of affected communities themselves in sort of every aspect of the work. And, you know, your focus on the need for place-based understanding, this idea that all disasters are local and they all also occur within a larger context, very important to keep in mind. So with that, we are going to turn to our final speaker, which is Havard Hegre. Very pleased to have him here. He's the Dag Hammarskjöld Professor of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University. But he's also at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, which is also known as PRIO. Welcome to you, Havard.
Thanks a lot. You can hear me, you can see the screen?
Yes, to both.
Thanks. So I'll look at the question of tracking compound risk from perhaps a bit more narrow perspective. So the perspective from research and conflict and governance. I'll touch upon many of the same concepts as Jakob and Susan have done. So with compound risk, I think of so just a second. I think of the risk of negative humanitarian impact, both long-term and short-term. I think this is one issue I'd like to put on the table, is that it's probably useful to focus a discussion on a more specific definition of what the impact that we are looking to assess the risk of is. So implicitly, I've just interpreted the topic here as negative humanitarian impacts, so such as in the long term excess mortalities and undernourishment, in the short term famines, or the humanitarian consequences. So compound risk hasn't been a very prominent feature of research in armed conflict and on governance, but it's explicitly present. So I work at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo and the Department of Peace and Conflict Research, and the very aim of establishing those institutions is to reduce the human suffering due to war. So the impact is very much implicitly present in peace and conflict research, but not necessarily explicitly. So I'll just take you quickly through some contributions to the assessment of compound risk. So there's monitoring of political violence and governance, as Susan mentioned, that's important. The field has good understanding of causes of violence and poor governance, and also of their effects. There are also some forecasting efforts that are fledgling compared to climate science, but nevertheless are starting to gain some traction. So what's the role of armed conflict and governance in compound disaster risk? Yes?
Note that your slides are not changing for some reason. I think they're supposed to be.
That's
sorry to interrupt, but
yes.
I'm sure you probably want to show them.
I'll try to share once more. So
no problem, we'll just stand by. There we go, we see it now.
Did it change?
It did, yes, perfect.
Okay, so I'll just skip the full screen and share it like this. So research very clearly shows that armed conflict and poor governance is both a cause of other events and impact multiplier for other events, such as armed conflict sustains poverty and hurts economic growth. It undermines the capacity to handle disasters. It undermines public health, fairly strongly so, causes forced displacement. All of these are the outcomes that I implicitly think is the topic of the compound risk that we're discussing here. But it's also clear that armed conflict and poor governance are closely related. So I've chosen to discuss armed conflict and governance jointly as two sides of the same coin. That's a somewhat controversial decision to do, but they are clearly related. Armed conflict and poor governance, they are mutually reinforcing. So poor governance leads to armed conflict and armed conflict leads to poor governance. They're also driven by some similar incentives for behavior that I can elaborate on if there was time. So this slide changed now, I hope. Okay.
Yes.
So there are also some feedback loops that adds to compound risk. So we know that armed conflict and poor governance is caused by many of the phenomena that are under the definition of compound risk that I'm thinking of here. So outcomes of the risk factors that be discussed by Susan and Jakob too. So poverty increases risk of conflict. We talk about the poverty conflict trap. And there are also big literature on rent opportunities that incentivize elites' use of violence. So that's both an outcome of conflict and also something that drives conflict behavior. Resist institutional reforms beneficial to the population is also something that drives armed conflict and poor governance. And many adaptations to natural disaster or measures to handle natural disasters are often resisted by elites for similar reasons. It's not so certain that armed conflict is directly caused by natural disasters. There is a fairly heated discussion in conflict research on whether droughts and natural disasters or other climate-related events cause conflicts. In the short run, they maybe don't. Same applies to protests and migration. But in the long run, if climate change and natural disasters have impacts on governance and on poverty and related factors, it's obvious that there is a strong feedback loop here too. So, so what can conflict research and conflict on governance or democratization bring to the table with for the assessment of compound risks? So there is, over the past 10 to 20 years, there's been a large increase in data collection efforts. So systematic tracking of political violence events. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program has been doing this for 30 years. And for the past 10 years, the ACLED dataset is monitoring political violence. There are data collection efforts on military coups, riots, and protests. There's also good data collection efforts on political institutions, in particular the Varieties Democracy dataset tracks very many facets of governance issues and changes to them every year. There are also some early warning efforts for armed conflict and for governance. So there are several ongoing projects like the CoupCast at the Open Earth Future, who is forecasting military coups. There's an early warning project for mass killings at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And there's the Views project, which I'm directing, which is looking into methods to warn about armed conflict. So the map to the right here is the prediction map for armed conflict in Africa in December 2020. So there was just some things that the research on armed conflict and governance could bring to the table. I think I'll just some ideas how to stimulate interdisciplinary work on compound risk assessment. Shared terminology and typologies is important. I could have used Jakob's typology if I was sufficiently familiar with them, but I'm not. So sharing those would be useful. Share data. Climate research is very good at sharing data. We should coordinate on how to define and measure impact. So one question I had is compound risk of what? I think in order to have fruitful collaboration, we need to be specific on that. We can coordinate on and quantify joint drivers of hazards. So to what extent are economic shocks and armed conflict driven by the same factors, for instance, and quantify joint drivers of vulnerabilities and collaborate on estimating how these hazards reinforce each other. Some contributions to such a collaboration from conflict and governance research. So what conflict research could do is to feed into impact assessments by using the monitoring and projection of governance institutions and political violence to estimate disaster vulnerability maps that could be useful for impact assessment in other fields. Also, our line of research can also estimate the direct impacts of political violence and governance events on the outcomes that we're concerned about. We can also estimate how natural disasters and climate change shape the conflict and governance directly. I think it would be useful to focus on common drivers. So for instance, it's very clear from our perspective that sustained economic growth reduces the probability of conflict, but it also improves governance and reduces vulnerabilities. So maybe a compound risk assessment should look into some of these drivers that are of relevance for all these fields. The same goes for antagonistic geopolitics that undermine efforts to promote good governance and economic growth. So thanks.
Many thanks for that, Howard, and that overview also of the role of compound risk, or its kind of emerging role in the peace and conflict research field. I know the questions are flowing in very quickly now, so I'm going to assess that while I hand things over to Dirk-Jan Omtzigt, who is the chief economist and head of the Humanitarian Financing Strategy and Analysis Unit at UNOCHA. Dirk-Jan, can you take things over from here and give us your perspective on what you've been hearing?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for a really timely discussion and such a rich set of presentations. I'm going to keep this brief because I want to give you the opportunity for some questions, but let me give you a couple of reflections. One, we in the humanitarian world really do see that humanitarian crises are not caused by a single shock, but by the confluence of climatic, socioeconomic conflict and public health shocks. And as already mentioned, the COVID crisis is a primary example of that, of cascading shocks, initially public health shocks compounded by economic contraction. And it didn't emerge in isolation. It really interacted with existing natural hazards like drought, floods, and locusts, and violent conflict. So this discussion could have not been more timely. And what's been laid out has been very, very helpful. Jacob really helpfully laid out a wonderful typology of compound events, and that really helps us put together a crisis timeline better. When we do, and I'll come to that in a second, anticipatory action, i.e. actions that get us ahead of a crisis, we often map out a crisis timeline. Now, I've got a singular shock that is a doable proposition, but if you've got multiple compounding shocks, that's very complex, right? And so actually getting a clear typology of what the type of interacting shocks are is useful to push us ahead on that construction of a crisis timeline. What we also see, and Susan really reminded of that, is that we really see rising vulnerabilities, and a small shock immediately puts a lot of people back into poverty. Up to 150 million people are expected to drop back into extreme poverty as a result of the current crisis, and on increasing exposure and interdependency of hazards. Now, what I really enjoyed were the closing remarks by Susan, where she highlighted the need to. There we are. One, science to be translated in practice, and practice to be translated back into science for it to be usable, useful, and used, as she said. And she made a call for moving to a predictive approach, something that Harvard also talked about. And that's actually the bedrock of some of the work that we're trying to do as well. Trying to get ahead of a crisis requires actually making a prediction of the impact of a shock. And so this is why we are now working with the World Bank on a kind of a global monitor of compound risk, because we want to collectively get ahead of crisis. And so what we want to get to is we've done some work together on pathways to peace. We actually now need to do similar work on pathways to crisis and figuring out what the inflection points are in that to be able to change the trajectory of that. And let me wrap up with 4 comments. One is that we should not get paralyzed by the complexity of this problem, because it's very easy to now get overwhelmed and think about big complex processes, and we never understand, and therefore the default is to do nothing, or be distracted by the tantalizing promise of technology. The primary objective of this work is to change the default to act instead of to do nothing. And so the question is, what sufficient evidence do we need for decision making rather than the perfect evidence? Secondly, why do we need to act? We now have really compelling evidence that getting ahead of a crisis and doing anticipatory action is much cheaper, really saves a lot of hard-won development gains, stabilizes peace and security, and more fundamentally is actually most dignified. So the third thing then is we need to actually think ahead first. What type of actions and when do those actions need to be implemented do we want to take? And then figure what the information requirement is that will allow us to take those actions in time. And those actions really need to change the trajectory of the crisis and need. And finally, for that to happen, we need to tie the actions that we think are appropriate and all this excellent research about how crises compound and interact to finance, because then we can actually ensure that action is taken at the right time. And the contributions by Jacob, Susan, Harvard really allow us to advance this this important agenda. So thank you very much indeed. And with that, let me hand it back over to you, Paige.
Thanks so much, Dirk-Jan. So briefly, I'm going to summarize the questions and then pass it back to the panel. We also got some questions in advance when people signed up for the event. So I'm not going to be able to address all of them, but I've grouped them into a few different categories. There were quite a few questions around assessing compound risk in the context of fragile countries or communities. And what are some of the challenges around doing that? So that we had three different questions about that. There were a number of questions relating actually to what Dirk-Jan was just talking about on the cost effectiveness and benefits of early action. How is it that compound risk can be used effectively for early warning and early action, or what are some of the examples of that? We had a very specific question for Susan about the societal reproduction of risk, if she would be willing or have time to expand on what that means. And then a big question, what are some of the main data gaps around monitoring compound risk? And of course, Susan already mentioned one about data at subnational level, but what are some of the other big ones? So I'm not sure who to hand it to first. Is there anyone who wants to take a stab at one of those questions, or all of them?
Let me unmute. The societal reproduction of risk is a term that's used to help us understand that society is just as much of a risk driver as the natural systems, that risk itself is a social construction, and society itself can increase or decrease risks. So in many ways, the actions of society can increase a risk profile through action or inaction in the same way that it can decrease the risk profile primarily through action rather than inaction. So it goes back to Dirk-Jan's point about if you don't act, then you may in fact be socially reproducing, society is socially reproducing risk.
Thanks, Susan. What about some of the data gaps? Could I ask Jakob or Howard to come in on that, or one of the other questions?
Yeah, I also see a question in the chat, which is maybe related from Anne van Loon, whether actually data needs to be related to the hazard. And so basically, if we need hazard associated impacts or just general impacts, and my take on this would be that we need all kinds of impact data to figure out what are the relevant hazards, and this can be climate hazards or all kinds of other hazards. But I think to do robust statistics with impact data, we need so a priori we cannot assume that we know what are the drivers of certain impacts. From at least that's kind of my approach on this. Of course, if you're expert on certain impacts, you can make some have some hypotheses, maybe you have a model. But in my opinion, we really need, in general, data on all kinds of impacts to do robust data analysis and statistics.
Thanks. And Howard, what about the early warning, since that is something that you do work on in the conflict space? How can compound risk contribute to that, and what are some of the challenges there you see?
I think the most useful meeting place between early warning or conflict and compound risks is really to look at impact. So, you know, I think I will second Jakob's call for good data on impact. So, for instance, health impact, or just forced displacement, to get good comparable data on where exactly they occur. So the more localized data, the better. So many of the phenomena that we are studying are quite rare, fortunately. So to get, but they are very serious when they happen. So we need really detailed data in order to get good models of the impact of the conflicts. And of course, with good data on impact, it's easier to model the feedback from these risks or the outcomes of the risks to conflict and poor governance.
But we also need, with that data, for example, on impacts, if we use sort of mortality data from hazards, events, or injuries, we need that data beyond the raw number. We need it broken down by gender, by age, by ethnicity and race, so that we can look at the disproportionate impacts on certain segments of society. And those data just are not there yet. I mean, even looking at people in camps, refugee camps, I don't think we have the data that is specific to what are the demographic characteristics of the populations within those areas. And then we need to be able to attribute it to the event or the compound risk that we're looking at. And the attribution, I think, is a large concern as well. Particularly, we see it now with COVID, when there is a death. There are many countries that are reluctant to attribute that death to COVID-19. They attribute it to other causes. And so the attribution becomes a big problem or a concern with the data as well.
That's right, and maybe excellent points to close as we now come to 11 o'clock. And I think also that went to some degree also helping to answer some of the questions about challenges in fragile and conflict-affected contexts in terms of getting disaggregated data and the problems of attribution. So I think that's a good way to end. I again want to thank our colleagues at the World Bank and at the UN for co-hosting this meeting, and wish them the best with the rest of the series. We're very, very pleased to be involved with this, but thanks especially to all of our panelists, to Susan and Jakob and Havard for joining us today. Thanks to everyone who joined. Goodbye.